So I've got a lot of questions about how I used a front-wheel drive car to go into the back of this dune buggy. So the front portion of this dune buggy isn't really anything special. Your pretty standard Volkswagen front axle and buggy build. So we're going to focus on the back using this V6 fuel injected engine from a front-wheel drive car. We're going to kind of cover some of the things that made that work. So the big advantage of using a front-wheel drive car is it's pretty much just set up to be in a buggy. It's already got the engine right over the trans and the axle and all that. Also, another thing is you can find a lot of cheap front-wheel drive cars. So this engine tranny setup is out of a 2000 Chevy Malibu V6. And the reason I started with that is just because it was cheap. It was 150 bucks. No reason other than that. If it was I would have bought a Honda, Ford, whatever. Didn't make a difference to me. Ended up with the Chevy, so I'll show you kind of how I did this. Another big advantage of using the front-wheel drive car back here is that, at least in my case, I left the steering rack intact. So I've set this thing up to do a rear steer too, with controls at the steering wheel. Ignore that busted taillight, and I'll show you how that works. So it works pretty good. And how that works is this is a window motor that I've welded a small sprocket on. You can see that down there. And I've attached a larger sprocket to the actual input of the steering rack. Now for the wheels to turn, the engine does have to be running because this window motor isn't powerful enough to actually turn the wheels without the power steering pump running and assisting. And you'll see this paint mark right here is on there, so I can line that up with these vice grips. So when I'm driving at high speeds, I lock those vice grips down just to make sure there's no play in the rear steer. Also, if you're going 80 miles an hour and you bump that switch up here, this switch right up here at the steering wheel, that would be a bad day. That'd throw you off the highway. So that's another little safety feature. And there's nothing fancy about this switch, it's just a reversing polarity switch up here. You can find those on Amazon. Back to the engine setup. So this is an electronically controlled fuel injected engine, so it has a fuel pump, and I chose to use the stock fuel pump. I cut it apart and made my own header to go into a custom gas tank. That's actually just the propane tank that I welded the fuel filler neck off of the donor car onto it. That's worked out good, no problems there. Don't have a gas gauge, and that has screwed me before. It's left me stranded. So you're gonna have to set up your cooling system, so I chose to mount a stock radiator right behind the seats, and I set it up so these fans run all the time. I have a main battery power disconnect switch behind the seat right there, and that keeps this thing nice and cool. So off the donor car, on that particular model, it had a cradle that the engine and tranny was all mounted to. So I unbolted that cradle out of the donor car, and I had to do some cutting, but I then welded it up, that's a skid plate there, to this actual frame. So the convenient thing about that is my A-arms, which were attached to that cradle, and the strut made it very simple to install in the buggy. So the original buggy, of course, didn't have any kind of strut mount because that's not the kind of suspension they used for Volkswagens. So this is just some pretty heavy duty steel built off of the frame. And the only issue I really had with this is that it was kind of hard to get the struts set up to where this thing would handle good, because you can get that strut angle off a little bit, and when you take turns it just kind of turns wonky. Now the gear shifter is stock. I just cut off the locating tab, so just to pop this thing in gear, all you gotta do is push it. And this makes it really nice if you're wanting to get after it. So you can just start off in first, pop pop it to second, pop it to third. No issues out of that. Stock key switch. And the brake booster off of the donor car. So this thing stops nice. So this turtle shell piece right here that you see is part of the donor car's hood cut. Even got a little bit of Bondo, yeah. But let's pull that thing off there because all the electronics are hiding in a suitcase under that. So here's a look at the quality suitcase. This is just from Harbor Freight. Let's pop this thing open so you can see what's inside. So got the fuse box, and this is off the donor car and everything. All right, if you have OCD, this is a warning. There it all is. So I even left the plug for the ICU. I have the ICU out of the donor car, but I never installed it in the Buggy. I just feel like that would kind of clutter up. So from the donor car, I harvested whatever that thing is. I believe this is the engine ECM. It was mounted inside of the car. And this was the interior fuse relay box. It was mounted inside the car, and this one was mounted outside the car. Now, I did not do any kind of tuning to make this work. So from the donor car, that's why I went ahead and harvested all this stuff, because I knew that the donor car ran, and I wanted to take as much stuff as I could to make sure I didn't run into some kind of weird electrical issue doing this swap. And I really didn't. The only real issue I guess I did run into was that the donor car had some kind of anti-theft system, but I was able to bypass that with a resistor wired in somewhere in this key switch. I don't quite remember what I had to do there, but the issue I had is after doing the swap, the unit would start and run for a few seconds and then just randomly die. And a quick Google told me that's what the issue was. I guess that was a common problem with them, was something failing and doing that. Since all the stock wiring and ECMs and whatnot is still on the vehicle, I am able to still plug in a code reader. Yeah, so I can just plug in your standard code reader and read the codes and diagnose any issues. And I have had to do that before. So I'm glad I left that in place. And I meant to mention, ICU is just the instrument cluster. So since I did not install the instrument cluster from the donor car, I don't have any way of knowing if I have a check engine light or anything like that. So if I have any issue, it would only show up on if the engine is running bad or something like that. So since I didn't install the ICU up here, I just have me a GPS speedometer. That works pretty good, no complaints. That keeps this all pretty basic up here. So of course, since the radiator is mounted in a different spot than it was in the front wheel drive car, I had to weld up some pretty interesting bends to the coolant plumbing. Just got the stock reservoir up there, and my overflow is just a metal water bottle. This transmission is electronically controlled, and I have had no issues out of it with this swap. So that was one of the things I was worried about when I initially did this. You can kind of see a peek there of everything tucked in there. And funny story, after I did this swap, you know, the engine when I bought it never really ran that great. But upon troubleshooting, I found that the head gaskets were blown, which if you know anything about this series of Chevy engines, the 3.1s, and I think 3.5, 3.4, something like that, they had a bunch of different displacements for the same engine. They're really known for that, for going bad. So I ended up having to do head gaskets in chassis like this while I had it out. To do the swap would have just been so easy. So maybe check your swap engine over really good before you actually put it into something. Don't be dumb like me. Another advantage of using a more modern fuel injected engine like this, like from a front wheel drive car, say over the traditional Volkswagen engine, is if you spend some money and time, you can build up a Volkswagen engine to some decent horsepower numbers. But with one of these things, you can just buy the engine, and out of the box, it'll have more horsepower than most Volkswagens. And also, say like with this automatic transmission, you got way better gear ratios. So you can just outrun them top speed and low speed. You got some pretty good options with the torque converter setup. I hope that answers some of your questions if you're thinking of doing this type of build. Now, bang for your buck, I don't feel like you can beat this. You got an engine that can go 100 miles an hour, and you can find lots of cheap front wheel drive cars to do a swap like this. That's all for today's video. You guys have a good day.